Hello guys, for this video this will be going into chapter 8 of Give Me Liberty. It'll actually be two parts. Part 1 is going to go from 1790 on the George Washington administration all the way up until the Jefferson administration in 1800. Part 2 will go into more detail with the Jefferson administration and transition to the market revolution of the early 19th century. Our objective is to understand the development of political parties and its impact during the 1790s. One of the things that's going to contribute to the development of political parties is Hamilton's program, and he basically wants to bring stability to the financial situation or the economy of the United States at this time. If you recall, under the Articles of Confederation, there was a little bit of chaos in terms of each state having its own economic plan. You had the issue with debt, and you had the issue with the inability of the United States to engage in trade with other nations. So Hamilton's program was really trying to nation build in a way, but also bring the economy together, but also more power to the central government. Again, like his idea would be to establish credit. One way he did that was to assume states' debt. Some states had debt, some states didn't. But if the nation were to assume the debt for the entire country, the idea would be that then the entire country would be vested in the welfare of the nation. That would be vested in this idea that since the whole country has a debt now, there is interest in making sure the country is successful. And by creating a new national debt, then we now have the ability to borrow, especially from the banks in Great Britain, and in turn create a national bank that could lend money to our government. So this plan is a bit complicated in terms of how it works in building up the power of the nation. But essentially, just understand this. If the country is in debt, then the entire country is interested in making sure the nation does well. So it's no longer a state issue, it's a national issue. And also, the understanding here is that because the country has this organized way of dealing with our finances, this will make us more attractive to engaging in trade, or rather engaging in the marketplace internationally with Europe. The other thing that this does is he wants to also attach a tax on whiskey to help fund the nation, along with a tariff on imports. And the tariff is trying to accomplish another thing as well. What the tariff is trying to do is to make it more attractive to buy things in America versus things made in overseas, to start building that industry here at home. And partly because at this time the nation doesn't have industry, and Hamilton wants to increase that ability. Hamilton has famously said the United States is Hercules in the cradle, so he wants to nurture this country to build it into an economic powerhouse. The other thing he wants to do is he wants to create a national army to defend itself against uprisings like Shays' Rebellion. But as a whole, this plan depended on closer ties with Britain, with Britain's economy, the ability to borrow from Great Britain in terms of money. So part of this plan is to help the economy, to build up the industry, and there are going to be some critics to this plan. Madison and Jefferson, on the other hand, felt the nation was not tied to money, was not tied to building up industry and banking, that our nation's future lied in westward expansion, that we shouldn't have closer ties to Europe, and actually farming was the key to the United States development, not industry. They felt that independent farmers were the backbone of this country, if you will. And they felt that selling farmers grain and other things to other nations would help develop the country in its own way, not industry, as opposed to what Hamilton wants to do. And they felt that they wanted to create a more equal society, and they were opposed to this idea what Hamilton wanted to do, because the idea of Hamilton having this country tied to banking makes it more like it's an elitist kind of society, that the elites would have power. And Madison and Jefferson have this idea that we want to create a more social, equitable society, and that's tied to farming. So they felt that Hamilton's plan would put more money in the hands of the rich. And for the most part, Hamilton wouldn't deny this. Hamilton very much is the idea that power and wealth should be in the hands of the elite, and the elites should run the country and less of the masses run the country. So now we have these two different ideas of revolution taking place. The American Revolution of the elites and the American Revolution of the masses come into these different forms with Hamilton's plan versus Jefferson's idea of how this country should move forward. So one of the things that came into issue was this idea of the national bank itself, which is a big part of Hamilton's plan for economic security of this country. Jefferson's going to argue that this bank is not in the Constitution at all. It is not in the Constitution. Hamilton will argue that, well, you have the elastic clause of the United States Constitution, which basically says providing for the general welfare of this country. In other words, it's not necessarily in the Constitution, but it is implied by the Constitution for the general welfare of the country. Jefferson would counter-argue that this is not in the Constitution, therefore it's unconstitutional. So you have a strict constructionist view of the Constitution by Thomas Jefferson, and you have more of an interpretive interpretation of the Constitution by Hamilton. Most of the people against what Hamilton wants will be in the South. The Southern interests are not tied to industry. The Southerners do not have this idea that we should industrialize as a nation. They're more tied to plantations and general agriculture interests, along with people that are farmers in the North, in the rural areas, do not feel that this country should be headed towards industry. So these groups generally tended to be against what Hamilton wanted. So there had to be a compromise. In order for Hamilton to get what he wanted, he had to appease the people that were against his plan. And one way to do that was, according to the Southerners, because this plan favors people with money so much, it favors the wealthy so much, and people that are in banking, that we need to remove them as far away as the capital as possible. So a bargain was struck that the new national capital, that would later be called Washington, D.C., would be built in the South between Maryland and Virginia. This would be a new district, a District of Columbia, and it would be away from the money interests in the North and closer to the South. So in order to get Hamilton's plan across, he agreed to this. And Jefferson got what he wanted in terms of having this new capital in the South. The other thing, aside from this difference between Hamilton and Jefferson on this new financial plan that's going to divide the country a little bit, will be the impact of the French Revolution. In 1793, you actually have Louis XVI will be executed, and this will shock Europe at the time, including people like George Washington and Hamilton. Jefferson and many Americans will actually celebrate this new French Revolution as an idea of self-determination and self-government spreading from the American Revolution and going into Europe. But to Washington and Hamilton, this is scary. This is a very fearful thing, and this will lead to chaos and anarchy where the masses will just rise up and attack the elites. So this is, again, dividing the American public between some people that feel that government should come from the masses, a more democratic idea of government, versus this idea that Hamilton and Washington have, that government should come from the elites, that should come from the leaders in the top of society. So yeah, again, you have this idea coming from the American Revolution. The American Revolution had two sides. The American Revolution from the elites, from the people at the top espousing Enlightenment ideas. And of course, you guys recall, you had the American Revolution of the masses, people like Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty. And you have these two different versions of the American Revolution taking place and dividing this country once in the 1790s between the elites at the top and people like Jefferson that feel like the masses should have more of a say in social equality. The problem here is that Washington is president of the United States, and Washington wants to direct us away from the French. Keep in mind, the French, some context here, guys, the French helped us with the American Revolution. If it wasn't for the French and the alliance we had with France, there would have been no victory at the Battle of Yorktown, largely due to the French Navy and military there. But Washington did not want us to get us involved in what was going on in France, especially with how scary to him the French Revolution was. So he issued a proclamation of neutrality, keeping us out of the conflicts of Europe. Other Americans were in favor of what was happening in France, so this kind of again started to divide Americans a little bit. And then you have Edmond Genet, a diplomat from France at the time, and he's actually here in America, this diplomat from France, and he's hiring American ships to attack British ships. He was actually trying to stir Americans up for support for the French. And if you don't have an understanding of diplomacy, well, one thing that's not supposed to happen is a diplomat's supposed to rile Americans up in terms of fighting war and in terms of military conflict with other countries. So Washington asked for his recall. On a side note, he didn't leave because he feared for his life back in France. So he ended up becoming an American citizen and marrying into an American family and stayed here. The other issue that's happening at this time, aside from the French Revolution, is that the American ships are being seized by the British. And the British are resuming this idea of impressment that happened earlier on during the American Revolution and before. This idea of impressment is American ships are being captured and Americans are being forced into the British Navy. This is angering Americans, so much so that we send John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to negotiate for a better situation with Britain. The problem was that John Jay didn't actually negotiate an end to impressment and no rights, actual rights for American shipping. He did have an agreement that the British would abandon their outposts on the western frontier, and the U.S. would actually favor British goods. When this treaty came back, this outraged many Americans that supported the France, because essentially we're agreeing more to be on the side of the British, further dividing Americans inside American society between favoring the British versus favoring the French. And essentially what this treaty does, it ends any kind of alliance that we had with France, ruining ties that we had since the American Revolution, and further dividing Americans and actually creating political parties. So now we have the two political parties being formed out of this growing conflict of the 1790s. Remember, it started between Hamilton and Jefferson, this little bit of rivalry between them because of the National Bank and Hamilton's financial plan. But because of Jay's treaty and these ongoing issues with the French and the French Revolution and Washington and Hamilton drawing closer to Great Britain, you have Americans divided on those two ideas. And Jay's treaty, if you will, was kind of the last straw. So the Federalists would be one political party. Now let's keep this in mind for this time period. I said this in the last video, and I'm going to say this again. The Federalists in the 1790s are not necessarily the Federalists of ratification of the Constitution. That was the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists of the 1790s are going to be a political party, and essentially they supported Washington Hamilton's economic plan. One big difference here is that during the ratification of the Constitution, the Federalists included James Madison. During the 1790s, James Madison is absolutely not a political party Federalist. He is going to be called a Republican, or rather a Democratic Republican, aligned with Thomas Jefferson. The Federalists were under this idea, like I mentioned just before, that they believed in hierarchy. They believed that power should be of the elites. Hamilton famously said of the rich, the able, and well-born. So definitely this idea that power, it comes from the top. There's certain people born at the top. There's certain people born at the bottom. And only people at the top should run society. The Republicans, led by Jefferson and Madison, are the opposite point of view. But keep in mind, I'm going to often refer to them as Republicans during the time period of 1790s. That is not to be confused with the Republicans of today. I guess the long name is the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans, but we're going to call them Republicans for short. So one of the first big instances that starts to culminate in more division is the Whiskey Rebellion. You have these Pennsylvania farmers that are angry about this whiskey tax that was done under Hamilton's plan. The problem with Pennsylvania farmers in the western part of Pennsylvania is it's very difficult to get their wheat to market. Transportation is not there at this time. It's much easier for farmers at this time to distill their grain into whiskey and transport that east to sell in the market. But by taxing whiskey, these farmers are angry because essentially they feel that their livelihood is being threatened. And remember, many of these farmers were revolutionary fighters, and in the revolution, these ideas of taxes and taxes affecting their livelihood really strike a chord with them, and they start to rebel. Well, unlike Shays' Rebellion, you have now the power under the Constitution to stop this kind of rebellion. So Washington leads militiamen into the rebellion. The first time ever and the last time ever, a president will actually lead troops into battle. And the other part of this here too is he actually wants to show Europeans the United States is a secure place to do business. Remember the whole idea of credit, the whole idea of showing Europeans, especially the British banks, that we are a secure place and we can engage in business. And part of that security is to put down rebellion and show the stability of the country. But others and critics like Jefferson, the Republicans at the time, are going to argue that this military is also a way to stomp out dissent, to stomp out people that might have a different opinion. And usually the military is used to abuse power. So they're a little fearful that this is going to set a precedent of the military being used to basically exert the power of the government when they see fit. So the Republican Party, like I mentioned earlier, is going to be led by Madison and Jefferson. And unlike the Federalists, they're going to be sympathetic to France. So one of the ongoing things here is you have these rivalries in Europe between France and Great Britain. Well, these rivalries will carry over into American politics, where the Federalists will have closer sympathies towards Great Britain. And because of the French Revolution, the Republicans are going to have closer ties to the ideas of France and have more sympathy toward France. They wanted a more democratic government, which is the opposite of what the Federalists wanted. They felt that we had to have a more equitable society and more people, especially small farmers, this yeoman farmer idea that Jefferson has, and that's where the morality of America should come from. That if we have a lot of people that are rich and wealthy, that corrupts society, that corrupts politics, and Jefferson rather felt that you have these small farmers that would be the moral and backbone of this country. So you have a lot of Republicans coming from wealthy Southern planters because they really don't like Hamilton's plan and industry, but you also have ordinary farmers in the rest of the country that support Jefferson. Each side, both the Federalists and the Republicans, are going to claim the American revolutionary ideas. Federalists are going to accuse Republicans of being accomplices of atheism and anarchism. They're going to be accused of French agents because of their fear of the French Revolution. They're going to accuse the Republicans of kind of being that chaotic ideas of the French Revolution, that they're going to accuse them of being traitors. Republicans are going to accuse the Federalists of basically worshiping tyranny, monarchists, kind of putting tyranny as idolizing tyranny, if you will, that they just want to have power and consolidate power to the top and be more like a king, if you will. So in this next section, we're going to understand the developing idea of liberty and the growing public sphere. One thing I want to address in this section is this idea that now you have this ongoing conversation between what liberty means. Does it mean like safety and security and that freedom that safe and living in a safe security has? Or does that mean the ability to express yourself and the ability to have a bigger say in government regardless of what level of society you're born into? Of course, the Federalists are going to agree more with this idea of security and safety, where the Republicans are going to have more of this idea of the ability to speak and engage in government and more of the masses having a say, a more democratic idea, or lend itself towards more democracy in this country. One of the things that's contributing to these growing discussions is you have newspapers really developing in the 1790s. During the 1790s, you have 100 to 260 newspapers, and by 1810, you actually have 400 grow at this time. So you have a lot of different people publishing at this time, and lots of different opinions circulating, and people engaging in this and thinking about it and talking about these things. People from all levels of society doing this. You have this creation of democratic republican societies, and they actually supported the French Revolution. You had about 50 societies develop, and Federalists felt that they were a threat to society. The Federalists felt that the government was the one that spoke for the voice of American people, not these self-created societies. But however, you did have these societies develop, and they actually gained a lot of support from immigrants from Great Britain that were fleeing Great Britain and felt that Britain was too oppressive. So you have this support among people coming into the country for the first time. The other thing that's starting to develop is the idea of women's rights. It's not necessarily as profound as it will happen later on, but you have the beginnings of this idea that women's ideas and how the law should treat women and women's role in society begin to change. One of the leaders of this idea would be Mary Wollstonecraft. She basically wrote the book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, and they felt that rights weren't just for men, that women need to have access to education and employment, and women, to a certain extent, should have a voice and representation, alluding to the idea of women voting and taking place in society. And actually, you have women taking more positions and discussions. In New Jersey, you actually have women vote. That would be true all the way into 1807. Not just women, but you also have free blacks vote in New Jersey all the way up into 1807. You have different women authoring books at this time. Hannah Adams supported herself as an author. Judith Sargent Murray wrote essays for the Massachusetts Magazine. She couldn't go to college, but she actually studied alongside her brother, who was going to Harvard. So women definitely counted towards representation. So when we talked about the Three-Fifths Compromise, definitely the idea that enslaved people are counting towards representation. But women as well are counting towards representation, And someone argued that under the logic of democracy, wouldn't they have a say? Wouldn't they have a say if they're actually being counted towards representation? Shouldn't they have a say in that government to a certain extent? But unfortunately for women, most people felt that politics was for men. The Constitution used the word he to describe office holders. And for the most part at this time, society was not at a point to where it could generally have women access and engage in politics in the same way men could. In this next section, the objective is to understand the impact of the Adams administration and the transfer of power, essentially that transfer of power to the election of Thomas Jefferson in 1800. So in 1796, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are going to run against each other for President of the United States. At this time, the majority of states chose their electors, but you actually do have some states where they actually vote on their electors, and in those states, you see a lot of intense campaigning. The thing to keep in mind in this situation is that second place, you have a vice president. So Adams is going to become president, but Jefferson, because he got second place, even being the opposite political party, he will be vice president. The issues that are happening here, as the United States claimed the right to trade non-military goods with Great Britain after this election. So John Adams is going to continue this idea that we have the right to engage in free trade in the oceans. France and Great Britain are not going to agree on these ideas, and both France and Great Britain are going to seize American ships. In an attempt to rekindle our relationship with France and reignite our alliance that we had with France, we send over diplomats to France. Unfortunately, though, the people that meet these diplomats are going to demand bribes of these Americans. And this will be controversial because the idea that even in order to have a conversation, we're going to have to pay money to these French envoys flew in the face of what Federalists felt was proper. And Adams actually let this information out, and in the information he referred to these envoys as XYZ. So this would be known as the XYZ affair. So essentially, because of the XYZ affair, this poisoned any kind of relationship we would have with France. So we begin this kind of quasi-war with the French, especially in the French West Indies, and we attack French ships. But in a way, by attacking these French ships, we're allying ourselves to the British, who are also at war with France. So even though we really haven't engaged in declared war against France, we are attacking them. And in a way, we are helping the British out. Later, by 1800, though, Adams would actually negotiate peace with France right before he leaves office. During the Adams administration, though, you have this growing fear of mostly Republicans, mostly people that follow the teachings of Jefferson or are allied with Jefferson and fans of the French Revolution, that fears that they're going to cause chaos and anarchy in our society. So you have these two new laws being created. You have the Alien Act, which deported people viewed as dangerous by the government. And you also have the Sedition Act, which prosecuted anyone that was critical of the government. And mostly the people that were being arrested were Republican newspaper printers. You actually have a congressman who's a Republican that gets arrested and serves several months in jail. Jefferson referred to this time period as a reign of witches, invoking the idea of the Salem witch trial and the chaos that was, and the terror there with the Salem witch trial. So out of these, especially the Alien Sedition Acts, you have these two new resolutions passed by Virginia and Kentucky. And it criticized the Alien Sedition Acts, and they criticized the idea that the national government did not have the authority to punish speech. This violated free speech, that authority only relied on the states. So understand what Jefferson's arguing here. Jefferson's arguing is that, especially under the Bill of Rights, especially in the First Amendment, that the states are the ones who can do things in terms of speech, that the national government does not have the power to do that, only the states. This is not the idea that individuals in the states can say whatever they want, because states do have policies that limit free speech. What the argument here is that the national government is violating that, and according to the Bill of Rights, it shouldn't happen. So the Alien Sedition Acts would cause John Adams, in essence, to lose his re-election in 1800 because of how unpopular this would be. So why do we call this the Revolution of 1800? The idea behind this historically is that we have two competing groups. And now with the presidential election of 1800, which Jefferson does win, you have this idea that you're transferring power from one group to another, one political philosophy to another. And in history up to this point, the understanding is when that happens, it's usually through violence. It's usually through revolution. And this is a bloodless revolution, this idea that John Adams steps down from power. He doesn't try to hold on to it. And you have Jefferson, who is the opposite political view, take power. And keep in mind, there was almost a constitutional crisis with this, because essentially Jefferson and Burr had a tie. You have this electoral college vote, 73-73, and in this crisis, you have actually Alexander Hamilton, who controls Congress at this point, who is the opposite political view of Jefferson. And remember those famous debates between Jefferson and Hamilton? And Hamilton actually picks Jefferson to be the next president of the United States because he feels that Jefferson, despite his differences with him, will carry the nation forward and respect the nation as a leader, where he feels Aaron Burr might be too selfish and might be just in it for himself. Later on, the 12th Amendment would be passed to end this idea of second place would be go to the vice president, that the vice president will run in a separate campaign. And Adams, like I said earlier, will step down after he loses the election. So in this next section, we're going to understand the impact the American and French Revolution had on African Americans. One thing to keep in mind, especially with these elections going on in the 1790s into the 1800s, is again a reminder that the 3/5 Compromise is giving the South a lot of power. If it wasn't for the 3/5 Compromise, actually, John Adams would have won the election in 1800 and Jefferson would have lost. So it does have some weight in terms of slavery and the role slavery plays in the power to the South, especially in representation in the House of Representatives, but also in terms of electing presidents. But the other thing to keep in mind is that there were actually people very vocal in ending slavery at this time. Petitions were made to Congress in 1787 to actually abolish slavery. And debates actually erupted in Congress. And Georgia and South Carolina were the most vocal in defending slavery. And although Madison is a Virginian, he was embarrassed by this defense because Madison and many others were there during the American Revolution and were embarrassed by this defense of slavery, especially in the ideals of the American Revolution, but argued that slavery should just be kept out of politics to stop any kind of division, foreshadowing, of course, the future divisions that are going to take place leading up to the Civil War. But the ideas of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, to a further degree, were not just limited to Europeans and people in the United States. Toussaint Louverture, an educated slave, started a rebellion in what we call Haiti today. And it was actually successful, led to Haiti as an independent nation in 1804. And the idea of liberty coming both from the American Revolution and French Revolution, this idea of independence, reached these slaves, and you have this revolution in Haiti take place because of that. Jefferson, writer of the Declaration of Independence, and someone that actually was in favor of the French Revolution, was kind of horrified by this idea that African slaves would use these ideas for their own liberation, for their own independence. And once he becomes president of the United States, he's going to do everything in his power to not support Haiti at all, because feels that it is a threat to the United States, especially the idea of freeing slaves, and slaves revolting could transfer here to America. And around 1800, you actually have what's called Gabriel's Rebellion. Gabriel was an enslaved person who was a blacksmith in Richmond, Virginia, and started this plot to actually free slaves. The idea is that they would march through Richmond and eventually capture Governor James Monroe and hold him hostage. And the hope was, with Gabriel and his fellow plotters, was the idea that poor whites would also join him in this idea against African enslaved people. And of course, poor whites would come together against the wealthy. The plot was found out and it was stopped. But the thing was that plotters spoke the language of revolution and liberty in a very similar way to what people in the Haitian Revolution did. So the ideas of the revolution, both the American and the French Revolution, are also permeating slaves. It's also permeating the ideas in which slaves communicate to each other. What is going to be the overall impact of this was you're going to actually have tighter controls, especially in Virginia, against blacks. One of these ideas is that African Americans are not going to be allowed to congregate on Sunday together. They put more restrictions on the ability for masters to actually free their slaves. And if there were slaves that actually were freed, they were required to leave the state of Virginia. And if they did not, they would be sold back into slavery. In our next video, part 2 of Chapter 8, Give Me Liberty, we're going to go into more detail of what happens during the Jefferson administration and leading into the War of 1812. Until then, thank you very much for watching.